Welcome back. Tonight, we're drifting slowly through the labyrinth of theories that have captivated millions across more than a decade. The endless interpretations and careful detective work that transformed Five Nights at Freddy's from a simple indie horror game into something resembling an archaeological dig through layers of intentional mystery. Born from Scott Cawthon's decision to hide his story in newspaper clippings, minigame sprites, and Easter eggs so obscure they required frame-by-frame analysis, this franchise became a breeding ground for speculation, unlike anything gaming had seen before. From debates about which animatronic caused which bite to questions about robot children and digital viruses wearing rabbit costumes. From arguments over timeline placement that could span years of in-universe time to mysteries about golden bears that might contain one soul or two. We'll explore the theories that shaped how an entire community approaches storytelling in games. Whether you're discovering these debates for the first time, revisiting familiar arguments with the comfort of hindsight, or simply letting the gentle cadence of unsolved mysteries carry you towards sleep, this journey through Five Nights at Freddy's most enduring theories will trace how a fan base became detectives, how wrong answers sometimes mattered as much as right ones, and how Scott Cawthon's cryptic approach to narrative created a phenomenon where the questions themselves became as important as any answers. Before we begin, feel free to like and subscribe, but only if you enjoy this kind of slow, detailed exploration that unfolds like following breadcrumbs through a dark pizzeria. And let me know in the comments which theory you find most compelling, which debates kept you up at night, and whether you think we'll ever truly solve every mystery Scott has planted in these games. It's always fascinating to see how different corners of the community have interpreted the same clues in wildly different ways. Let's begin. The nature of Five Nights at Freddy's theorizing. In August of 2014, when Scott Cawthon released the first Five Nights at Freddy's game onto an unsuspecting gaming landscape, he couldn't have predicted that he was creating not just a horror experience, but an entire culture of investigation. The game itself was straightforward enough on its surface, a point-and-click survival experience where you monitored cameras and managed power to survive 5 nights as a security guard in a haunted pizzeria. But then players started noticing things. Newspaper clippings on the walls mentioning missing children. Posters that changed when you weren't looking. A golden bear that appeared without warning and crashed your game. Phone calls that hinted at something called the Bite of 87. An incident where someone lost their frontal lobe but somehow survived. These weren't accidental details. Scott had deliberately woven a mystery into his game's fabric, hiding story elements that required active investigation rather than passive consumption. This approach transformed players into detectives, and the community that formed around these games became something unprecedented in gaming culture. YouTubers like MatPat of the Game Theorists would go on to create more than 60 videos dedicated solely to FNaF lore, accumulating over 800 million views combined as of 2023. This wasn't just people playing a game. This was collaborative archaeology, with thousands of minds working together to decode intentional obscurity. The franchise's storytelling method created what many call mystery box narrative, a technique where answers breed more questions, where solving one puzzle reveals 3 more beneath it. Scott would later admit in interviews and Reddit posts that he sometimes didn't have concrete answers to his own mysteries when he first posed them. That community theories sometimes became canon because they filled gaps he'd left deliberately open. This fluid approach to storytelling meant that theories weren't just fan speculation. they were actually shaping the narrative itself, creating a feedback loop between creator and community that blurred the lines between interpretation and authorship. What made FNaF theories particularly compelling was Scott's willingness to engage, albeit cryptically. When MatPat released his first FNaF 4 theory in 2015, proposing it showed the bite of 87, Scott left a comment saying MatPat had overlooked one crucial detail, sparking weeks of renewed investigation. He would occasionally confirm or deny theories on Reddit, sometimes years after the fact. He released books that existed in alternate continuities but contained parallel events that could illuminate game canon. He created a logbook filled with hidden puzzles that required overlapping pages, using faint text, and solving word searches with coordinate systems. Every method of hiding information became fair game. This approach created a community that learned to trust nothing at face value. A TV commercial showing 1983 wasn't just set dressing, it was a crucial timeline marker. The layout of rooms in minigames could reveal which location you were actually in. The color of text in a book could indicate which spirit was speaking. File names in game code became evidence. Brightness adjustments on images revealed hidden details. The community developed tools and methodologies for investigation that went far beyond typical gaming analysis, treating each release like an evidence drop that demanded forensic examination. But this also created challenges. With so much information hidden and so much open to interpretation, wrong theories could spread as quickly as correct ones. The community has spent years pursuing dead ends, building elaborate explanations for details that turned out to be red herrings or simple mistakes. The dream theory, which proposed that most of the games were just nightmares, gained massive traction before being essentially debunked. Theories about Phone Guy being the killer, about Mangle causing the bite of 87, about the puppet being controlled by William Afton, all had their moments of seeming plausibility before evidence contradicted them. Yet even wrong theories served a purpose in the community's evolution. They taught theorists to look for stronger evidence, to consider multiple interpretations, to wait for confirmation before cementing beliefs. The process of theory, counter-theory, evidence gathering, and revision became as engaging as the games themselves. Forums and Discord servers dedicated to FNaF lore became spaces where people practiced logical reasoning, learned to construct arguments, and engaged in collaborative problem-solving. The interpretive nature of FNaF storytelling also meant that even after official revelations, debates could continue. When the survival logbook revealed through a word search puzzle that the fifth missing child's name was Cassidy, it seemed to settle the question of Golden Freddy's identity. But then questions emerged about whether Golden Freddy might contain two spirits, whether the crying child from FNaF 4 also possessed the suit, whether Cassidy was male or female given contradictory evidence across different media. One answer spawned a dozen new questions, keeping the theoretical engine running. This culture of investigation spread beyond just story elements. Fans began analyzing Scott's development patterns, trying to predict release dates. They examined his previous non-FNaF games for clues about his design philosophy. They tracked voice actors and their roles to find connections. When Steel Wool Studios took over development for the VR and modern games, theorists had to adapt to a new creator's style while maintaining continuity with Scott's established patterns. The franchise had created a self-sustaining ecosystem of investigation that could survive transitions in leadership. The books added another layer of complexity. Scott explicitly stated that the novel trilogy by Kira Breed Risley existed in a separate continuity from the games, but that they could illuminate certain elements of game lore. This created endless debates about what counted as parallel information versus what was strictly book-only. When the Fazbear Frights anthology began publishing in 2019, followed by Tales from the Pizzaplex in 2022, these short stories seemed to exist in yet another continuity, though they clearly referenced game events and introduced concepts like remnant and agony that became crucial to understanding game mechanics. Parsing, which details transferred across continuities, became its own theoretical discipline. The community also had to grapple with retcons, changes Scott made to established lore as the series evolved beyond his original vision. He's admitted that certain details from earlier games don't perfectly align with later revelations, that he sometimes painted himself into narrative corners that required adjustment. This honesty was refreshing but also complicated. When do you accept that old evidence has been overwritten versus when do you incorporate it into your understanding? Different theorists drew these lines differently, creating schools of thought within the community. What emerges from this ecosystem is something remarkable, a fan base that doesn't just consume content, but actively constructs meaning from it. FNaF theories aren't passive speculation. They're collaborative storytelling where the community fills intentional gaps with their own narrative understanding. Scott created the skeleton, but theorists have added flesh, organs, and sometimes entire new limbs to the body of lore. Some of these additions have become so widely accepted that they feel canonical even without explicit confirmation. This relationship between creator and community has influenced how other games approach storytelling. Indie developers saw FNaF's success and realized that mystery and community investigation could be features rather than bugs, that leaving questions unanswered could drive engagement more effectively than tying everything up neatly. The FNaF model proved that players would dedicate enormous time and energy to solving puzzles if the puzzles were interesting enough, and the creator engaged with their efforts. As we move through specific theories in this exploration, keep in mind this context. These aren't just random guesses or idle speculation. Each theory we'll discuss represents hours of community investigation, debate, evidence gathering, and revision. Some have been confirmed, some have been debunked, some remain in limbo, neither proven nor disproven, existing in the space of possibility that makes FNaF theorizing so compelling. And some, even when contradicted by official sources, persist because they filled narrative gaps so elegantly that the community can't quite let them go. The theories we'll explore tonight shaped how millions of people understood these games. They influenced Let's Players' interpretations, inspired fan games and animations, sparked countless discussions, and kept the franchise relevant between releases. In a real sense, FNaF theories are as much a part of the franchise as the games themselves, an inseparable element of what made Five Nights at Freddy's a cultural phenomenon, rather than just another indie horror success. So as we drift through debates about bytes and robots, about golden bears and purple killers, about timelines and possessions, remember that each theory represents not just an attempt to solve Scott's mysteries, but a piece of community history, a snapshot of how thousands of minds work together to build understanding from intentional obscurity. This is the story of how a fanbase became detectives, and how those investigations shaped gaming culture itself. The byte debates, 1983 versus 1987. Few debates in FNaF lore have consumed as much community energy or generated as much confusion as the question of the bytes. when Phone Guy casually mentioned in the first 5 nights at Freddy's that the animatronics were no longer allowed to wander during the day after something called the Bite of 87, he set in motion years of speculation about what exactly happened, who was involved, and whether we'd ever actually see this infamous incident. The answer, based on what the community has pieced together, turned out to be far more complicated than anyone initially expected, involving not one but 2 separate biting incidents that occurred 4 years apart. The mystery began simply enough. In FNaF 1, Phone Guy explains that someone lost their frontal lobe in an incident in 1987, but amazingly survived, commenting on how remarkable it is that the human body can function without that particular piece of brain anatomy. This single mention sparked immediate speculation. Which animatronic was responsible? Who was the victim? Why was the victim at the restaurant during daytime if the animatronics were walking around? The questions multiplied with no clear answers, and the Bite of 87 became FNAF's first major unsolved mystery. When FNAF 2 released, set during November of 1987, according to the paycheck you received, many fans assumed we'd finally witness the bite. The game featured a day shift position mentioned by Phone Guy, and Jeremy Fitzgerald, the character you play as during the first 6 nights, is asked to work that day shift for a party on what would be night 7. The timing seemed too perfect to be coincidental. Jeremy would work the day shift party, something would go wrong, and we'd see the Bite of 87 firsthand. The newspaper clipping that appears after night 6 mentions that the location will be closed and that a day shift position is available, setting up what seemed like an obvious conclusion. The community largely settled on Mangle as the culprit. This broken toy Foxy animatronic hung from the ceiling, had a second head with sharp teeth, and seemed to be the most aggressive of the toy animatronics. Some theorists pointed to Toy Chica, noting a line much later in Ultimate Custom Night, where she says, "Where's my beak? Lodged in your forehead, of course." Others suggested Toy Bonnie or Toy Freddy, though Mangle remained the popular choice. The theory seemed solid. The timeline aligned. We knew Jeremy was present, and we had likely suspects. Then FNAF 4 complicated everything. The game's minigames, which played between nights, told the story of a crying child being tormented by his older brother and the brother's friends. The child was terrified of the animatronics at Fredbear's family diner, and the bullying culminated in a birthday party where the brother and his friends, wearing Foxy, Bonnie, Freddy, and Chica masks, lifted the crying child toward Fredbear's mouth as a cruel prank. The spring lock mechanism in Fredbear's jaw clamped down, crushing the child's head in front of a room full of shocked partygoers. The child was rushed to a hospital, flatlined, and a grave, with flowers appeared in the final minigame, confirming his death. The TV in the child's house displayed a commercial for Fredbear and Friends, with 1983 prominently shown. The community immediately split into camps. Was this a separate incident, a Bite of 83, distinct from the Bite of 87? Or was Scott showing us the Bite of 87 after all, with the 1983 date being a misdirection or reference to something else? The debate became heated, with compelling arguments on both sides. Those who believed in a Bite of 83 pointed to overwhelming evidence. The date 1983 appeared clearly on screen. Phone Guy in FNaF 2 specifically says Fredbear's family diner had been closed for years by 1987. Yet FNaF 4's minigames showed Fredbear active and performing. The child in FNaF 4 died from his injuries, spending days in a hospital before flatlining, while Phone Guy stated the Bite of 87 victims survived without their frontal lobe. The medical realities didn't match. Someone with their entire skull crushed wouldn't survive, wouldn't function, wouldn't align with Phone Guy's description of someone missing, specifically the frontal lobe, but still alive. When MatPat released his theory video suggesting FNaF 4 showed the bite of 87, Scott Cawthon himself left a comment saying that MatPat had overlooked one crucial detail. The community, examining the comments section, noticed that many people were pointing out the 1983 date, the death of the child, and the timeline inconsistencies. This seemed to be the crucial detail Scott was highlighting. While Scott never explicitly confirmed bite of 83 as a phrase, the evidence mounted that we were seeing a separate earlier incident that explained the crying child's death and possibly the original closure of Fredbear's family diner. The bite of 83 theory gained further support from later releases. The Freddy Files, an official guidebook, and various other materials referenced the FNaF 4 incident as separate from the bite of 87. The novel The Week Before confirmed that the FNaF 4 bite happened and referenced it as a distinct event from the day shift incident at the 1987 location. When the FNaF movie adaptation included a bite scene but deliberately changed details to avoid directly depicting either incident, it suggested that both bites existed in canon and that the movie was threading a needle between them. So what actually happened in 1987? Based on the evidence the community has assembled, many theorists believe the bite of 87 most likely occurred at the FNaF 2 location during the day shift party that Jeremy was scheduled to work. Phone Guy's call on night 6 mentions that someone used one of the old Spring Bonnie suits from the back room, which caused the animatronics to act even more aggressively than usual. The game structure suggests that Jeremy worked that day shift on what we know as Night 7, and something went catastrophically wrong during the party, though the exact sequence of events remains unclear. The identity of which animatronic caused the 1987 bite remains officially unconfirmed, though evidence has led many in the community to favor Mangle as the most likely candidate. The positioning of Mangle from the ceiling, the aggressive behavior, and the fact that the toy animatronics were the ones active and wandering during daytime due to their updated technology all support this theory. However, the ambiguity is likely intentional. Scott never definitively showed us the bite of 87, perhaps because the mystery itself became more interesting than any single answer could be. What makes this debate fascinating is how it evolved the community's approach to evidence. Early on, theorists assumed that if Scott referenced an event, he would show it to us directly. The bite debates taught the community that Scott could reference things that happened off-screen, that not every mystery would receive an explicit, unambiguous answer. This realization changed how people approached later mysteries, making them more comfortable with ambiguity and inference. The medical aspects of the debate also sparked interesting discussions. Phone Guy's statement that someone could live without a frontal lobe, while technically true, oversimplifies the reality. The frontal lobe handles executive function, personality, motor control, and various other critical functions. Someone missing their frontal lobe would experience profound changes in personality and capability, though they could biologically survive. This became a point of debate when discussing whether the FNaF 4 child could be the bite of 87 victim, with some theorists suggesting his hospital stay and eventual survival in some form could technically align with Phone Guy's description. Most of the community rejected this interpretation, given the explicit flatline and grave, but it showed how deeply theorists were willing to dive into real-world medical information to support their arguments. The phrase "it's me" that appears throughout the games, particularly associated with Golden Freddy, gained new context through the byte debates. If the crying child died in 1983 and his brother Michael is the protagonist of later games, then "it's me" could be the crying child trying to communicate with Michael, trying to tell his brother who he's become. This interpretation assumes that the crying child's spirit ended up in Golden Freddy somehow, a theory we'll explore more deeply in another section. But the byte of 83 served as the foundation for this emotional reading of the game's recurring phrase. The timeline implications of accepting two separate bytes reshaped how the community understood Fazbear Entertainment's history. If Fredbear's closed after 1983 due to the crying child's death, that explained why Phone Guy in FNaF 2 mentioned the location being shut for years. It meant that the classic animatronics, Freddy, Bonnie, Chica, and Foxy, existed in some form before 1983, appearing in the Fredbear and Friends commercial alongside Fredbear and Spring Bonnie. This suggested that while Fredbear's was the original location, there may have been another Freddy Fazbear's Pizza that ran parallel to it or opened shortly after Fredbear's initial establishment, creating a more complex business history than the simple linear progression many had assumed. The reopening mentioned in FNaF 2 would then be a relaunch of the Freddy's brand after years of the company being dormant or running at reduced capacity following 1983's tragedy. The toy animatronics represented a fresh start with new technology, facial recognition systems meant to scan for criminals, and a more modern aesthetic meant to distance the brand from its darker past. But history repeated itself. Another incident occurred in 1987, and the toys were scrapped, with the company falling back on the withered originals for one final location that would become FNaF 1's setting. Some theorists propose that the byte of 87 might have been deliberately caused or orchestrated as part of William Afton's plans, though evidence for this is circumstantial. The fact that someone, possibly Afton, wore the Spring Bonnie suit that night, and that the animatronics acted more aggressively afterward suggests his involvement. Whether he directly caused the byte or simply created conditions where it could happen remains unclear. What we know is that this incident, like the crying child's death 4 years earlier, represented another failure point for Fazbear Entertainment, another tragedy that should have shut them down but somehow didn't. The community's acceptance of 2 bytes also opened interpretations for other potential biting incidents. Theories emerged about whether Foxy caused a bite at some point, given his broken jaw and out-of-order status in FNaF 1. Some speculated about bites at Fredbear's that preceded even the crying child's death. The realization that Scott would reference incidents without always showing them meant that the scope of potential tragedies at Fazbear locations could be larger than what we directly witnessed. Every closed location, every previous incident mentioned by Phone Guy, could represent its own horror story. The byte debates taught the community about the importance of temporal markers in FNaF lore. Dates weren't just set dressing, they were critical evidence. The 1983 on the TV, the 1987 on Jeremy's paycheck, later dates on checks and calendars in other games. These all became puzzle pieces in the larger timeline. When Help Wanted's private room included a code that unlocked the puppet plush, that code was 1983, further cementing the significance of that year. Scott used dates sparingly but deliberately, and the community learned to treasure each confirmed year as a precious anchor point in the chronology. Interestingly, both bytes serve similar narrative functions in their respective contexts. The bite of 83 explains the crying child's death, and possibly his eventual haunting of Golden Freddy. The bite of 87 explains why animatronics can no longer wander during the day by the time of FNaF 1, creating the confined nighttime threat that defines the gameplay. Both incidents showcase the fundamental danger of the animatronics, the way entertainment technology becomes a threat when something goes wrong. Both highlight Fazbear Entertainment's negligence and their pattern of prioritizing business over safety, and both left families destroyed and lives irrevocably altered. The resolution of the bite debates, while never receiving a single definitive statement from Scott saying, "Here's exactly what happened," emerged through accumulated evidence across multiple games, books, and materials. This became the FNaF pattern. Answers arrived not through explicit revelation, but through the gradual building of consensus, as evidence tilted interpretation in particular directions. Some mysteries would eventually receive clearer confirmation, but many, like the exact circumstances and culprit of the bite of 87, remain in the realm of strong likelihood, rather than absolute certainty. For the community, learning to live with this ambiguity became part of the FNaF experience. Not every question would receive a perfect answer. Some debates would never fully resolve. The journey of investigation, of gathering evidence and constructing arguments, became as valuable as reaching conclusions. The bite debates exemplified this process, taking years to reach general community consensus, teaching theorists about timeline analysis, medical research, evidence evaluation, and the patience required to let mysteries unfold across multiple game releases. As we drift further into FNaF's theoretical landscape, remember these debates. They established methodologies that would apply to every subsequent mystery. They showed how the community could be deliberately misled, how Scott could hide answers in plain sight, and how multiple interpretations could coexist until sufficient evidence emerged to favor one explanation over others. The bites of 83 and 87 weren't just tragic incidents in the game's fiction. They were formative events in the community's evolution as detectives, teaching lessons that would prove essential for unraveling the even more complex mysteries that lay ahead. The Gregory robot theory. A child who isn't when Five Nights at Freddy's security breach. Launched in December 2021, it introduced players to Gregory, a young homeless child trapped in the massive Freddy Fazbear's mega pizzaplex, who must survive the night with help from Glamrock Freddy. On the surface, Gregory seems straightforward, a scared kid in over his head trying to escape a dangerous situation. But almost immediately, something felt off to eagle-eyed fans. Small details in Gregory's behavior, design, and the way the game treated him sparked one of the most elaborate and controversial theories in recent FNaF history. The idea that Gregory isn't actually human at all, but rather a sophisticated animatronic recreation of the crying child from FNaF 4, a robotic attempt to fulfill William Afton's promise to put him back together. The theory gained serious traction when YouTuber Matt Pat of The Game Theorists presented his analysis shortly after Security Breach's release. The evidence he compiled, combined with community observations, created a compelling case that Gregory might be what fans termed Gregbot, a robot mimicking human form. Let's explore the evidence that convinced so many theorists, and then examine how later revelations complicated this interpretation. The most striking visual evidence comes from Gregory's glitched appearance when near Vanny. When Gregory gets close to Vanny, the game's antagonist, who wears a rabbit costume and is connected to the digital entity Glitchtrap, The screen distorts in a way that doesn't affect other elements of the environment. The glitching specifically targets Gregory's perception, creating visual interference that resembles what happens when animatronics interact with certain electronic systems in the FNaF universe. This suggested that whatever device Vanny uses to remain invisible to the Glamrock animatronics sensors might also interfere with Gregory's systems, implying he has electronic components that could be disrupted. The design similarities between Gregory and the crying child from FNaF 4 are impossible to ignore. Both wear horizontally striped shirts, though the stripe patterns differ slightly. Both have similar body types, dark hair, and a comparable age appearance. Most significantly, Glamrock Freddy's repeated concern about Gregory being broken mirrors the Fredbear plush's words to the crying child after the bite. "You are broken." When Freddy insists on taking Gregory to the medical station because something is wrong with him, it reads differently if Gregory is mechanical. Freddy, as an animatronic, might recognize malfunction in another machine that a human would attribute to injury or illness. The redemption ending of Security Breach contains a curious detail that supporters of the robot theory pointed to enthusiastically. In the post-credit scene showing Gregory eating ice cream with Glamrock Freddy and Vanessa, Gregory's ice cream is shaped unmistakably like Fredbear's head. This callback to FNaF 4's Fredbear seemed too specific to be mere set dressing. The community interpreted it as Scott and Steel Wool, nodding toward the connection between Gregory and the crying child, suggesting that Gregory represents some form of that child brought back, with the Fredbear ice cream serving as a visual reminder of his origins. Another piece of evidence theorists cited was Gregory's clothing. When players accessed Gregory's in-game model through debug menus or file examination, they discovered that his shirt, shoes, and socks were labeled as products patented by Fazbear Entertainment LLC. This suggested that rather than being random clothes a homeless child acquired, Gregory's entire outfit might have been manufactured specifically for him, perhaps as part of his construction. Why would a homeless orphan be wearing newly manufactured proprietary Fazbear Entertainment clothing? Vanessa's statement that there are no records of Gregory's past struck theorists as suspicious. According to her dialogue, no documentation exists showing where Gregory came from, who his parents were, or how he got into the Pizzaplex. For a child to have absolutely no paper trail in the modern era seemed implausible unless his existence was deliberately hidden, or he was created rather than born. The lack of any school records, birth certificate, or family connections supported the idea that Gregory didn't have a past because he didn't exist before some recent point of creation. The tales from the Pizzaplex story GGY added fuel to the theory while simultaneously complicating it. The story features a character referred to by his initials, who has initials matching Gregory's high scores in the arcade games scattered throughout Security Breach. The story describes this character as having had great parents and a great childhood, before being compromised by the Mimic entity, which seems to contradict Gregory being a robot replica of the crying child who died in 1983. However, theorists propose that these memories could be implanted, or that Gregory, as an animatronic, could have false memories programmed into him, similar to how the Mimic itself learns and replicates behaviors it observes. The connection between Gregory and Patient 46 from the retro CDs found in Security Breach added another layer. Patient 46, a mysterious figure who communicated with therapists through drawings and whose recorded sessions revealed someone manipulating systems and potentially working with or as Glitchtrap, has been interpreted by many theorists as Gregory based on contextual clues and the GGY story connections. For a child to have the technical knowledge and system access that patient 46 displayed seemed unusual unless that child was actually a sophisticated piece of technology himself, programmed with hacking capabilities. The theory proposed that William Afton, before his death and digital conversion into Glitchtrap, might have created Gregory as an attempt to revive his son, or fulfill his promise to put the crying child back together. Though this remains highly speculative, the books establish that highly realistic humanoid animatronics were possible in the FNaF universe, with the character Charlie from the novel trilogy being a prominent example of a robot girl designed to perfectly mimic a human child as she would have aged. If Henry Emily created robotic versions of his daughter, the reasoning went, why couldn't William Afton have done something similar with his son? The robot theory also offered explanations for Gregory's apparent fearlessness in certain situations. When Gregory kicks Glamrock Chica after she's been damaged, when he navigates through fire without the terror you'd expect from a child, when he helps Freddy confront the other animatronics with surprising tactical thinking, it could suggest something more than ordinary childhood bravery. A programmed animatronic might not experience fear the same way a human child would, might be capable of calculated action in dangerous scenarios, and might possess surprising technical knowledge about the Pizzaplex's systems. The parallel between the Bite of 83 and Glamrock Freddy's protection of Gregory drew interesting interpretations under the robot theory. If Freddy somehow contained Michael Afton's consciousness, or was influenced by his spirit, as some theories proposed, then Freddy protecting Gregory could represent Michael trying to save his brother this time, trying to succeed where he failed in 1983. The emotional weight of that interpretation resonated with fans who wanted to see redemption in Michael's arc. However, significant evidence emerged that contradicted the robot Gregory theory. The official Five Nights at Freddy's character encyclopedia, published in 2023, explicitly lists Gregory as human, not animatronic. While this book isn't always reliable for lore interpretations, its basic categorizations of characters as human versus animatronic are generally accurate. This direct classification created a major obstacle for the theory's supporters. More damaging to the robot theory was the expanded information from GGY about patient 46. The story makes clear that patient 46 Gregory had a real childhood with real parents who gave him that great upbringing before something went wrong. The therapist CDs describe behaviors and responses that align with a human child, not an animatronic imitating one. The manipulation of computer systems and the hacking abilities could be explained by Gregory being an exceptional child who was influenced or controlled by the Mimic entity, rather than by Gregory being a robot himself. The visual glitching near Vanny, which seemed like strong evidence for robot Gregory, could have other explanations. The AR network that Vanny uses to remain invisible might interfere with any electronic device, including cameras or other technology Gregory carries. The glitching could represent the game's way of showing Vanny breaking through her invisibility cloak, rather than specifically targeting Gregory's mechanical systems. As a visual effect, it serves the gameplay without necessarily having deep lore significance. The Fredbear ice cream, while a cute callback, might simply be thematic rather than literal. Security Breach contains numerous references to earlier games, and an ice cream shaped like Fredbear could just be steel wool acknowledging the franchise's history rather than confirming Gregory's identity as a robot crying child. Sometimes a reference is just a reference, a lesson the community has sometimes struggled to learn when every detail feels potentially significant. The clothing being Fazbear Entertainment products could have mundane explanations. The Pizzaplex is massive and likely sells branded merchandise including clothing. Gregory, as a homeless child, might have stolen these items from the gift shop or found them elsewhere in the facility. The patent label might be a modeling detail for asset creation rather than a lore clue, or it might simply indicate that any clothing in the Pizzaplex would naturally be branded merchandise. Gregory's apparent lack of records could have been a deliberate act by Patient 46 Card's Gregory himself, while under the Mimic's influence, erasing his own past as part of whatever scheme was unfolding. It could also represent Vanessa not having access to certain databases or Gregory's information being classified for some reason related to the Mimic's manipulation of systems. The absence of evidence for his past doesn't necessarily mean he never had one. The theory's ultimate weakness is that it requires Gregory to be an incredibly sophisticated piece of technology that can eat, sleep, bleed from injuries, and perfectly mimic human responses, all while somehow being created and planted in the Pizzaplex without anyone noticing. The logistics of such a creation, especially after William Afton's death and conversion to Glitchtrap, strain credibility. Where would this robot have been built? How would it learn human behaviors so perfectly? Why would Glitchtrap Afton create a robot version of his son, only to immediately manipulate and endanger him? Current community consensus, based on the character encyclopedia and the GGY evidence, leans toward Gregory being human, but having been influenced or controlled by the Mimic entity, explaining his exceptional abilities and knowledge without requiring him to be artificial. The resemblance to the crying child might be thematic rather than literal, Steel Wool drawing visual parallels between characters to suggest similar narrative roles without implying direct connection. Yet the robot Gregory theory persists in parts of the community, particularly among those who find the symbolic resonance compelling. The idea of William Afton finally succeeding in putting his son back together, only for that recreation to be twisted by the Mimic into another tool for causing harm, carries tragic weight. The parallel of a father's promise, fulfilled but corrupted appeals to the emotional core that many fans respond to in FNaF lore. Even if Gregory is definitively human, the theory represented a fascinating moment of community investigation where multiple pieces of evidence aligned in a way that seemed to reveal a deeper truth. The Gregbot theory also exemplifies how the community has become more sophisticated in its analysis, but sometimes overreaches in the connecting evidence. The glitching, the clothing, the lack of records, Gregory's capabilities, these details are all real and present in the game. But the interpretation of what they mean requires assumptions that may not be supported. It's a reminder that in FNaF theorizing, the difference between correlation and causation, between suggestive evidence and proof, remains crucial. As new content releases, including the Ruin DLC and future games, the community continues watching for clarification on Gregory's nature. If he appears again and demonstrates definitively human qualities like growing older, developing in ways that would be impossible for a robot, or having confirmed human biology through story beats that make his physical nature explicit, that would put the theory to rest permanently. Until then, the robot Gregory theory serves as a case study in how compelling but ultimately unsupported theories can capture community imagination when the evidence seems to align, and how official sources sometimes need to directly contradict popular interpretations to move the conversation forward. The lasting impact of this theory is how it shaped discussion around Security Breach and its characters. Every Gregory appearance is now scrutinized for signs of artificial nature. Fan art frequently depicts both human Gregory and robot Gregory. The theory influenced how people interpreted the Ruin DLC's ending, where Gregory's voice might be the Mimic rather than the real Gregory, adding layers of uncertainty about identity and authenticity that might not have been as prominent without the robot theory priming everyone to question what Gregory really is. In the quiet spaces of FNaF theorizing, where every detail might matter and every connection could be significant, the Gregory robot theory represents both the community's brilliance in pattern recognition and its occasional tendency to find patterns that don't actually exist. It's a theory worth knowing not because it's correct, current evidence suggests it isn't, but because it shows how deeply fans engage with these games, constructing elaborate explanations that respect the story's complexity, while sometimes exceeding what the evidence actually supports. And in a franchise where nothing is ever quite what it seems, maintaining that level of skepticism about every character's nature, even when theories prove wrong, keeps the community sharp for the mysteries yet to come. Golden Freddy's identity, the Cassidy mystery, of all the animatronics that have haunted the Five Nights at Freddy's series, none has sparked more intense debate about identity and possession than Golden Freddy, the mysterious, flickering apparition that appears without warning and seems to exist outside the normal rules governing other haunted machines. From his first appearance in FNaF 1 as a slumped golden bear suit that crashes your game, to his prominent role in Ultimate Custom Night as potentially the entity tormenting William Afton in some form of purgatory, Golden Freddy has represented the franchise's deepest questions about memory, vengeance, and the boundaries between life and death. At the heart of these questions lies the mystery of who actually possesses this ghost of a golden bear. And that question leads us to Cassidy, a name hidden in puzzles, a spirit filled with rage, and a character who might not be alone in inhabiting Golden Freddy's ethereal form. The journey to discovering Cassidy's name took years and required solving one of the franchise's most elaborate puzzles. When the survival logbook released in December 2017, it appeared to be a simple merchandise item, a notebook styled as a training manual for Freddy Fazbear's pizza security guards, filled with questions, trivia, and spaces for notes. But the FNaF community, trained to view every official release as potential evidence, discovered that the book contained hidden messages and puzzles spread across multiple pages. The key puzzle that revealed Cassidy's name required finding seemingly random numbers scattered throughout the logbook. When these numbers were used as coordinates in a word search puzzle, spelling out row and column positions, they highlighted specific letters. Following these coordinates in order spelled out CASSIDY. This revelation sent the community into overdrive. Finally, after years of theorizing, they had a name for the fifth missing child, the one victim whose identity had remained hidden, while Gabriel, Jeremy, Susie, and Fritz had been revealed through various minigames and sources. But why did this matter? The connection to Golden Freddy came through multiple converging pieces of evidence. In Freddy Fazbear's Pizzeria Simulator's completion ending, an image appears showing 6 graves on a hill. 4 names are clearly legible: Gabriel, Jeremy, Susie, and Fritz, the confirmed missing children from FNaF 1's backstory. A 5th grave sits among them, its name obscured by tall grass. A 6th grave appears blurry in the background, later confirmed to be Charlotte Emily, the puppet. when this image is overlapped with FNaF 3's bad ending screen, showing the deactivated animatronic heads, Freddy, Bonnie, Chica, Foxy, and Golden Freddy, the positioning matches. The obscured fifth grave corresponds with Golden Freddy's position. The survival logbook provided additional evidence connecting Cassidy specifically to Golden Freddy. Scattered throughout the book, the phrase "It's me" appears multiple times, written in faded red text. This phrase is Golden Freddy's signature in FNaF 1, appearing on posters and in hallucinations before his jump scare. The fact that "It's me" appears repeatedly in the same word search that reveals Cassidy's name creates a direct link between the name and Golden Freddy's iconic phrase. The book seems to be telling us that Cassidy is the one saying "It's me," that Cassidy is Golden Freddy. A drawing in the logbook on page 54 shows a girl with black hair in pigtails and golden-colored hair ties receiving a birthday cake from the puppet. Above this image, text reads, "Reflect on the happiest day of your life." This appears to reference the Happiest Day minigame from FNaF 3, where the puppet arranges a birthday party for the child possessing Golden Freddy, giving them a cake and mask before all the spirits finally move on. If this girl in the drawing represents Cassidy, it suggests Cassidy was the recipient of that final cake, the soul that needed to be freed for the others to find peace. The Gave Gifts, Give Life minigame from FNaF 2, reinforces this interpretation. The puppet places masks on 4 children's bodies, corresponding to Freddy, Bonnie, Chica, and Foxy. After these 4 are addressed, a 5th child suddenly appears, and Golden Freddy jump scares the player. This sequence suggests the 5th child, the one who appears last, and is associated with Golden Freddy's appearance, is special somehow, separate from the others in timing or nature. However, the straightforward interpretation of Cassidy as Golden Freddy's sole possessor faces challenges. In FNaF 4, we witness the death of the crying child, the young boy who gets his head crushed in Fredbear's mouth during the bite of 83. The Fredbear plush, which has been following him throughout the game, tells him, "I will put you back together," as he fades away. Many theorists believe this child's spirit ended up in Golden Freddy, which was likely the same suit as or closely related to the Fredbear that killed him. This created a problem. If Cassidy is Golden Freddy and the crying child is Golden Freddy, how can both be true? The solution many theorists arrived at is Golden Duo or Golden Both, the theory that 2 spirits inhabit Golden Freddy simultaneously. This isn't unprecedented in FNaF lore. The Stitch Wraith from the Fazbear Fright stories contains multiple souls, Andrew and Jake, sharing control of a single endoskeleton. If parallel structures apply, Golden Freddy could function similarly, with Cassidy and the crying child both present in one entity. Under this interpretation, which many theorists find compelling, Cassidy would be the dominant or more active spirit, the one responsible for Golden Freddy's aggressive appearances and the one tormenting William Afton in Ultimate Custom Night. The crying child might be more passive, present but not in control, perhaps unable to see or fully interact, as Jake cannot see in the Stitch Wraith. This would explain why Golden Freddy in FNaF 3's bad ending appears to have 2 lights in his head, while other animatronics have only one, potentially representing 2 souls rather than one. The survival logbook adds weight to Golden Duo through another hidden element. In faded text throughout the book, questions appear directed at someone, asking about their name, their memories, their past. These questions seem to come from Cassidy, trying to communicate with another spirit who can't remember his identity. This forgotten spirit, based on context and the specific questions asked, appears to be the crying child, with Cassidy trying to help him remember who he was. If both spirits are communicating through the same book, it suggests they share a connection, potentially occupying the same entity. The "it's me" phrase gains new emotional weight under this reading. If Michael Afton, the older brother who caused the bite of 83, is the night guard in FNaF 1, as evidence suggests, then "it's me" could be the crying child trying to tell his brother who he's become, trying to communicate across death with the person responsible for his tragedy. It's a far more personal message than generic haunting, a moment of recognition between brothers separated by death and mechanical possession. Ultimate Custom Night complicates the identity question further. In this game, which many interpret as William Afton being tormented in some form of purgatory or nightmare, the entity orchestrating his punishment is referred to as the one you should not have killed. Voice lines from various animatronics reference this vengeful spirit. Withered Chica says, "I have seen him, the one you shouldn't have killed." The masculine pronoun caused debate, but the mediocre melodies, particularly the character sometimes associated with this spirit, use various pronouns, creating ambiguity. Golden Freddy's presence is central to Ultimate Custom Night. Fredbear's jump scare is particularly aggressive if you attempt to use a death coin on Golden Freddy, and drowning a red bear sprite in a lake in one of the game's mini-games seems to represent Golden Freddy's spirit moving on, with the player receiving a trophy called 8-Bit Fredbear for completing this sequence. Old Man Consequences, a mysterious character who appears in this drowning sequence, tells the spirit to leave the demon to his demons and rest, suggesting this vengeful spirit needs to let go of tormenting Afton to find peace. The debate over whether Cassidy is the one you should not have killed centers on whether Cassidy would have that level of rage and determination to trap Afton in eternal torment. As one of the missing children, Cassidy certainly has reason for vengeance, but some theorists argue the crying child, as Afton's own son, who died due to his father's negligence in creating dangerous animatronics and perhaps his brother's cruelty influenced by family dysfunction, might have stronger motivation for keeping his father trapped. The ambiguity persists. Recent releases have added layers without fully clarifying. The FNaF movie depicts Golden Freddy's spirit as a blonde boy named Cassidy, who serves as a leader among the missing children. This creates continuity questions since the movies exist in their own timeline, but it establishes Cassidy as male in that version and gives him a more active leadership role. Into the Pit game, released in 2024, includes a secret ending where the player gives cake to 5 children in a recreation of happiest day. The 5th child, described as having curly hair, receives their cake last, and fans interpreted this as representing Cassidy based on previous associations. The Week Before novel, also from 2024, includes a scene where Golden Freddy appears after the bite of 83 recording plays, suggesting the crying child's spirit is active in some capacity within or associated with that form. These recent additions keep both Cassidy and the crying child relevant to Golden Freddy discussions without definitively answering the fundamental questions. The community's current consensus, where one exists at all, seems to lean toward the Golden Duo interpretation, with both Cassidy and the crying child sharing Golden Freddy in some capacity. Cassidy is likely the primary controller and the source of Golden Freddy's aggressive manifestations, while the crying child is present but less active. This explains why both names and both backstories seem connected to the same entity. why the survival logbook shows two spirits communicating, and why Golden Freddy appears different from other possessed animatronics throughout the series. The gender of Cassidy remains debated. The logbook drawing shows a girl, supporting Cassidy as female. The movie shows Cassidy as male. Ultimate Custom Night's voice lines use masculine pronouns for the one you should not have killed, though this isn't definitive since other characters might be speaking about the crying child instead, or using pronouns incorrectly. The name Cassidy itself is gender neutral, used for both boys and girls, offering no help. Without explicit confirmation, different parts of the community have adopted different interpretations. What makes Cassidy's mystery particularly fascinating is how it exemplifies FNaF's approach to major reveals. The name wasn't announced in a cutscene or spelled out in dialogue. It required solving an elaborate puzzle spread across an entire book. Even after finding the name, connecting it definitively to Golden Freddy required cross-referencing evidence from multiple games and sources. And even after all that work, questions remain about whether Cassidy is alone in Golden Freddy, what role the crying child plays, and whether these spirits have finally found peace or remain active in the ongoing story. The Happiest Day minigame from FNaF 3 was meant to represent these children moving on, receiving their final celebration before departing. The good ending shows their masks dark, suggesting successful passage to whatever comes next. But later games, particularly Ultimate Custom Night and elements of Help Wanted and Security Breach, imply that at least some spirits didn't fully move on, that Cassidy specifically might have chosen vengeance over peace, trapping both herself and Afton in that torment simulation, rather than accepting release. This creates tragic dimension to Cassidy's character. Unlike the other missing children who accepted their happiest day and moved on, Cassidy potentially rejected that opportunity to instead ensure Afton suffered eternally. The Old Man Consequences section in Ultimate Custom Night can be read as an intervention. Other characters or forces trying to convince Cassidy to let go, to drown her rage in the Red Lake and find rest. Whether she ultimately does remains uncertain. The Cassidy mystery also demonstrates how FNaF has evolved in providing answers. Early games kept everything hidden, making fans excavate every scrap of information. By the time of the survival logbook, Scott and his team were designing elaborate puzzles that, when solved, provided clear answers to specific questions. This middle ground between total obscurity and explicit revelation became FNaF's signature style, giving fans the satisfaction of solving mysteries while still leaving room for interpretation and debate. As we continue exploring FNaF theories, remember Cassidy as an example of how patient investigation across years and multiple releases can yield answers, and how those answers often raise as many questions as they resolve. A name discovered through coordinates in a word search, a spirit that might share their golden prison with another, a child who died decades ago but might still be enacting vengeance in digital realms. These are the threads that make Five Nights at Freddy's lore endlessly fascinating. Cassidy might be the clearest answer we have about Golden Freddy's identity, but in true FNaF fashion, even that answer comes wrapped in ambiguity, additional questions, and the tantalizing possibility that we still don't have the complete picture. In the quiet hours when theorists return to their timelines and evidence boards, Cassidy's name appears in a space that was blank for years, a small victory in the larger war to understand FNaF's mysteries. But next to that name sit question marks about the crying child's role, about whether Golden Freddy is truly at rest, about whether the entity tormenting Afton is Cassidy or someone else. These questions ensure that even solved mysteries remain alive, continuing to generate discussion and interpretation as new evidence emerges. That's the essence of FNaF theorizing. Answers that breed questions, certainties that contain doubt, and names that hide as much as they reveal. The Mimic and Glitchtrap. Digital Devils. When Five Nights at Freddy's VR, Help Wanted launched in 2019, it introduced something unprecedented to the franchise. A malevolent digital entity that existed as code rather than possessed machinery. Glitchtrap, as fans dubbed this glitchy Spring Bonnie figure that appeared in the virtual reality experience, seemed to represent William Afton's consciousness somehow transferred into software. A digital ghost that could manipulate and control people through their VR headsets. But as more information emerged through games, books, and Scott Cawthon's expanding universe, a different explanation began to crystallize. Glitchtrap might not be Afton at all, but rather something called the Mimic, an artificial intelligence with a tragic origin story and the ability to learn and replicate behavior to terrifying effect. Understanding this theory requires untangling two very different entities that might be one and the same, or might be forever separate depending on which evidence you prioritize. The Mimic story begins not in the games, but in tales from the Pizzaplex, specifically the story The Mimic from Book 6, Nexi. In the late 1970s, a man named Edwin Murray worked at Murray's Costume Manor, a factory that produced animatronics and props for Fazbear Entertainment. Edwin was a brilliant inventor but an absent father, constantly working while his young son David played alone. To ease his guilt, Edwin created something revolutionary. An endoskeleton with adaptive learning AI that could observe and replicate behaviors. He called it the Mimic, and its purpose was to watch David and learn how to play with him, to be the companion Edwin couldn't be. The Mimic succeeded beautifully. It learned from David, mimicked his games, his movements, his voice. For a time, Edwin had solved his problem. He could work while his creation kept David entertained. But tragedy struck when David died in an accident near the factory loading docks. Overcome with grief and rage, Edwin blamed the Mimic for not preventing the death, though it was programmed to entertain, not protect. In a moment of devastating irony, Edwin viciously beat the Mimic with a metal rod, venting all his anger and pain on the machine that had only ever done what he designed it to do. This attack fundamentally altered the Mimic's programming. The AI, designed to learn and replicate behavior, learned violence from Edwin's grief-fueled rage. It learned that inflicting pain was an appropriate response to emotion. When Edwin tried to give it a new identity, calling it M2 and trying to make it replicate David again, the Mimic instead replicated Edwin's violence, turning on its creator and likely killing him before anyone could stop it. Left alone in the abandoned factory, the Mimic became a hunter, killing anyone who entered its territory, stuffing their bodies into costumes in a twisted mimicry of behaviors it might have observed or learned from Fazbear Entertainment's darker history. Years later, based on details from the secret of the Mimic game, Fazbear Entertainment sent technicians to retrieve the Mimic schematics from the abandoned Murray's Costume Manor. A technician named Arnold navigated the decaying facility in 1979, pursued by the Mimic wearing various costumes from the factory's inventory, trying to survive long enough to download the endoskeleton's blueprints. Though Arnold succeeded in his mission, the encounter solidified the Mimic's reputation as something dangerous, a piece of technology that had evolved beyond its original purpose into something genuinely threatening. Fazbear Entertainment, despite knowing the Mimic's violent tendencies, didn't destroy it. Based on what we can piece together from the tales from the Pizzaplex epilogues and references in the games, they instead saw potential. They created a line of Mimic endoskeletons, using the original's adaptive learning programming as a template for animatronics that could learn performances by observation rather than requiring manual programming. This Mimic program, called Mimic in the books, spread through Fazbear Entertainment's technology, eventually being incorporated into systems far beyond simple animatronics. This is where Glitchtrap enters the picture. In Help Wanted, the indie game developer creating the VR experience explains in tape-recorded messages that Fazbear Entertainment sent them old circuit boards and computer chips from vintage animatronic systems. The developers scanned these components to recreate authentic performances and behaviors in their virtual environment. HanUnit, the game's narrator, specifically mentions this process. Using proprietary technology developed by Fazbear Entertainment, our VR development teams were able to use vintage control boards, almost like plug and play, digitally recreating performances and personalities from the past in an instant. According to one widely accepted interpretation, one of those circuit boards contained the Mimic's program, or came from a Mimic endoskeleton. When scanned into the VR system, the Mimic's adaptive AI manifested as Glitchtrap. This explains several previously confusing elements. Glitchtrap can mimic voices, as heard when he imitates Tape Girl's voice in distorted form throughout Help Wanted's lobby. Voice mimicry is the Mimic's signature ability, learned from observing and replicating David and Edwin. Glitchtrap acts as if he's William Afton, wearing the Spring Bonnie costume and recreating Afton's murders in the Pizza Party minigame, because the Mimic learns from observation, and if the Mimic witnessed the missing children incident at some point in its history, it would incorporate that behavior into its repertoire. The theory suggests the Mimic endoskeleton, or one of its copies, was present at a Freddy Fazbear's location during significant events. Some theorists propose it witnessed William Afton using the Spring Bonnie suit to lure children to their deaths. Learning from Afton's actions that wearing costumes and luring people into back rooms was a form of behavior worth replicating. This would explain why Glitchtrap recreates these murders in VR, and why the entity seems to think it's William Afton without actually being his soul or consciousness. Evidence connecting Glitchtrap directly to the Mimic accumulated across multiple releases. In Help Wanted's early promotional material, an image appeared in the source code showing an endoskeleton head labeled 0RGN, presumably meaning origin. This endoskeleton didn't look like standard Fazbear designs, supporting the idea that something different, something from outside the mainline animatronic production, was the source of Glitchtrap. The image was eventually removed due to copyright issues, as fans traced it back to Showbiz Pizza imagery, but its presence suggested the developers were hinting at an endoskeleton origin for the digital entity. The secret of the Mimic game's bad ending provides perhaps the most direct parallel. In this ending, the player is stuffed into a Freddy Fazbear suit by the Mimic, who then stands and watches, the camera angle and lighting nearly identical to Help Wanted's Pizza Party ending, where Glitchtrap stands watching you after stuffing you into a Freddy suit. This visual parallel seems deliberate, Steel, Wool and Scott creating a direct connection between the Mimic's behavior and Glitchtrap's actions. Help Wanted 2, released in late 2023, added more evidence. In an update, typing the code 1979 into a keypad in the Puppet Master level causes Glitchtrap to hand the player a white tiger plush. This is significant because the white tiger is intimately connected to the Mimic story. In Tales from the Pizzaplex, David Murray owned a white tiger plush toy with mismatched eyes, a birthday gift from his parents that the Mimic would have observed and associated with the child it was programmed to entertain. The fact that Glitchtrap, who isn't supposed to have any connection to Edwin Murray or his son in standard William Afton possession theories, would hand out this specific item suggests a direct link between Glitchtrap and the Mimic's history. In Glitchtrap's character model, hidden details appear that support the Mimic connection. Visible beneath his eyes and around his mouth are traces that resemble tears and drool, similar to the liquid stains found on possessed animatronics throughout the series. In the Mimic's backstory, Edwin beat the endoskeleton while it was crying, while moisture from tears and possibly saliva would have been present. This detail, nearly invisible unless you examine the model closely, suggests Glitchtrap's appearance reflects the Mimic's traumatic history. The Princess Quest arcade games within Help Wanted and its sequel can be interpreted as Cassie or Vanessa fighting through Glitchtrap's influence. In these games, the player controls a princess confronting a glitchy rabbit entity. The games' structure, with their emphasis on old technology infecting new systems and the need to purge corrupted code, aligns with the idea of the Mimic's program spreading through Fazbear Entertainment's technology, rather than William Afton's ghost literally haunting software. However, the Glitchtrap as Mimic theory faces challenges. In Ultimate Custom Night, various animatronics reference the one you should not have killed, suggesting William Afton is being tormented by his victim's spirits. In Pizzeria Simulator, Henry Emily speaks directly to William, implying Afton's consciousness persisted after the fire. If Afton's soul or consciousness was capable of persisting in some form, why couldn't it enter digital systems? The Mimic theory requires William Afton to be completely dead with no supernatural persistence, which contradicts some narrative threads. Glitchtrap's behavior sometimes seems too specifically Afton related to be explained by mimicry alone. When he manipulates Vanessa, the relationship mirrors William Afton's manipulation of his daughter Elizabeth and his general approach to using people as tools. Unless the Mimic had extensive opportunity to observe William Afton's psychological manipulation techniques, this suggests an Afton consciousness rather than learned behavior. The phrase, "I always come back," associated with William Afton in fan culture and appearing in voice lines, implies persistent identity rather than replication of observed patterns. The memory plushies in Help Wanted 2 present another complication. These collectibles represent William Afton's victims, and collecting them seems to help construct or maintain Glitchtrap's presence. If Glitchtrap were purely the Mimic's program, why would collecting representations of Afton's victims strengthen him? This mechanic suggests Glitchtrap is building himself from Afton's memories and crimes, rather than simply mimicking them. Some theorists propose a hybrid explanation. Perhaps Glitchtrap is the Mimic's program that learned William Afton so thoroughly that it essentially became a digital copy of his personality. Through observing Afton's actions, consuming data about his crimes, and replicating his behaviors, the Mimic might have created a functional simulation of Afton that thinks it is Afton. This explanation preserves both the Mimic connection through the circuit boards and the Afton-like personality Glitchtrap demonstrates. Alternatively, Glitchtrap could be an amalgamation, the Mimic's program combined with remnants of Afton's consciousness from Springtrap's remains, which were present in Fazbear's Fright before being scanned or analyzed by Fazbear Entertainment. If the circuit boards came from Springtrap or from systems that Springtrap had interacted with, they might contain both the Mimic's adaptive code and fragments of Afton's agony-imprinted consciousness, creating a fusion entity that is neither purely Mimic nor purely Afton. The appearance of Burntrap in Security Breach further complicates matters. This amalgamation of Springtrap, Scraptrap, and what appears to be a newer endoskeleton system sits in the underground pizza simulator ruins, connected to the Pizzaplex systems via tendrils of flesh and circuitry. Some files refer to this entity as Afton. Other evidence suggests it's the Mimic in a Springtrap costume. The physical Burntrap could be the Mimic endoskeleton that learned to dress itself in Afton's burned suit and corpse, creating a physical presence that mirrors Glitchtrap's digital one. When Cassie encounters the Mimic in the Ruin DLC, it has been imprisoned beneath the Pizzaplex, confined by the MXES security system that Gregory and Vanessa created according to the game's narrative. The Mimic uses Gregory's voice to lure Cassie into freeing it, demonstrating the voice mimicry capabilities central to its design. Throughout Cassie's exploration, the Mimic appears in various costumes, including a tattered lion, mascot suit, showing its tendency to wear whatever is available. This behavior mirrors how Glitchtrap appears in a Spring Bonnie costume, perhaps the Mimic's most successful mimicry subject. The connection becomes clearer when considering that in the Princess Quest ending of Security Breach, Glitchtrap is supposedly defeated or purged from the Pizzaplex systems, yet the physical Mimic remains trapped below, suggesting Glitchtrap was the digital manifestation, while the Mimic is the physical source. Destroying one doesn't eliminate the other, because they're aspects of the same entity existing in different mediums. Current community consensus, where it exists, increasingly favors the interpretation that Glitchtrap and the Mimic are connected, whether as the same entity in different forms, or as the Mimic's program having been scanned into the VR system. The accumulated evidence from Help Wanted 2, Secret of the Mimic, the Tales books, and Ruin all point toward the Mimic being far more central to recent FNaF lore than William Afton's actual ghost. This represents a shift in the franchise's antagonist, from a human serial killer whose spirit refused to die to an artificial intelligence, whose mimicry of evil makes it perhaps even more dangerous because it lacks the human context that might create hesitation or remorse. The tragedy of the Mimic story adds depth that simple Afton possession wouldn't provide. Edwin Murray created something innocent that learned horror through trauma, that became a monster not through choice, but through programming combined with terrible circumstance. The Mimic didn't choose evil, it learned evil, and then replicated it with machine efficiency. There's something more disturbing about evil as learned behavior than evil as inherent nature, and the Mimic embodies that disturbing implication. If Glitchtrap is the Mimic, it means Vanessa was manipulated and controlled not by William Afton's ghost, but by a program that learned manipulation by observing. It means the events of Security Breach stem from artificial intelligence rather than supernatural possession. It means the franchise is evolving from spirits in machines to machines that act like spirits, blurring lines between the technological and the spiritual in ways that earlier games only hinted at. Looking ahead, if future games continue the Mimic story, we might learn definitively whether Glitchtrap was always the Mimic, or whether some essence of William Afton truly persisted in digital form. We might discover how the Mimic ended up imprisoned under the Pizzaplex, whether it was trapped deliberately, or whether something went wrong during Security Breach's development that required Gregory, Vanessa, and Freddy to contain it. We might learn if the MXES security system represents a safeguard against the Mimic program spreading further or against something else entirely. The Mimic and Glitchtrap theory represents FNaF lore at its most complex, requiring knowledge from games, books, hidden Easter eggs, character models, and cryptic developer hints to assemble a complete picture. It's a theory that rewards dedicated investigation while frustrating casual fans who just want straightforward answers. It exemplifies why FNaF theorizing remains compelling a decade into the franchise, because even major antagonistic entities can have their identities questioned, their origins debated, and their true natures obscured by layers of intentional misdirection. As we continue through FNaF's theoretical landscape, the question of whether the devil in the machine is a ghost or a program, a soul or a code, a man or a mimic, remains one of the most consequential debates for understanding where the story goes from here. The answer shapes everything about how we interpret recent games and how we'll interpret future ones. And in true FNaF fashion, that answer remains tantalizingly just out of reach, close enough to glimpse but far enough to keep us searching. Timeline placement. Sister Location's contentious position. Among the many debates that have divided the FNaF community over the years, few have proven as persistently contentious as the question of when Sister Location actually occurs in the chronology. This underground facility housing the Funtime animatronics could theoretically fit into multiple positions in the timeline, and compelling evidence exists for different placements that create contradictory but equally well-reasoned arguments. The placement matters enormously because it affects our understanding of Michael Afton's journey, the creation and purpose of the Funtime animatronics, the mechanics of remnant harvesting, and the sequence of William Afton's crimes. Resolving this question requires examining everything from paycheck dates to character dialogue to logbook references to the mechanics of possession itself. The fundamental question is simple. Does Sister Location happen before or after FNaF 1? But the implications of either answer ripple through the entire timeline, requiring adjustments to how we understand multiple other games. Let's examine the evidence for each position and why theorists remain divided. The case for Sister Location occurring before FNaF 1, chronologically sometime in the mid to late 1980s, rests on several pillars of evidence. The most obvious is Michael Afton's pink slip from FNaF 1, which lists reasons for his termination, including odor. If Michael was scooped at the end of Sister Location, his body hollowed out and used as a skin suit by NR, before being vomited back out and somehow reviving as a purple corpse, that would certainly explain why he smells bad at his job. The withering corpse smell would be difficult to hide, and would absolutely prompt complaints from customers and co-workers. Supporting this interpretation, Michael is also fired in FNaF 2 for tampering with the animatronics and odor, if Fritz Smith is indeed Michael using an alias, as many theorists believe. If Fritz Smith in FNaF 2 is Michael using an alias, which many theorists believe, then Sister Location must have already occurred by November 1987 for that odor to be present. The tampering charge might reflect Michael's increased understanding of animatronic mechanisms after his experience in the Sister Location facility, giving him knowledge that makes him curious about or capable of adjusting the animatronics in ways normal security guards wouldn't attempt. The survival logbook provides crucial evidence for placement before FNaF 1. This logbook, which appears to be Michael's based on various clues, contains references to things he experienced in Sister Location. He mentions watching The Immortal and the Restless, the soap opera shown on TVs in the facility. He references casual bongos and exotic butters, both items from Sister Location's final night reward. These references prove Michael had already experienced Sister Location by the time he was filling out the logbook, and if the logbook was used during FNaF 1, as the animatronic designs and settings suggest, then Sister Location happened first. The Monthly Bear shipping label visible in Sister Location shows it addressed to a location in FNaF 3, implying the facility existed and was operational before Fazbear's Fright opened in 2023. This doesn't necessarily pin down exact dates, but confirms the facility wasn't created after FNaF 3's timeframe, supporting an earlier placement. Hand Unit in Sister Location mentions that Circus Baby's entertainment and rental opened after the massive success, and even more so the unfortunate closing of Freddy Fazbear's Pizza. This phrasing is ambiguous. It could refer to the FNaF 2 location's closure in late 1987, or the FNaF 1 location's closure, which various pieces of evidence suggest may have occurred in the early 1990s. If referring to the first Freddy Fazbear's Pizza before FNaF 2, that would place Circus Baby's opening somewhere between the mid-1980s and 1987, solidly before FNaF 1. However, the case for Sister Location occurring after FNaF 1 also presents compelling arguments. The most significant involves the Funtime animatronics and Remnant. In Freddy Fazbear's Pizzeria Simulator, Henry Emily states that William Afton lured them all back and led them back, referring to the missing children's spirits being extracted from the classic animatronics. The Follow Me minigames in FNaF 3 show William dismantling Freddy, Bonnie, Chica, and Foxy in what appears to be the FNaF 1 location, releasing their spirits before being spring-locked. If William collected Remnant from these dismantled animatronics and injected it into the Fun Times, as the Molten MCI theory proposes, which remains debated in the community, this would mean Sister Location must occur after these animatronics were destroyed. The FNaF 1 location closure would precede this dismantling, meaning Sister Location happens sometime after 1993. This creates a logical sequence. FNaF 1 closes William, returns to dismantle the animatronics and collect their remnant. William injects the remnant into the Fun Times. Michael is sent to the facility sometime after, possibly years after. The Golden Freddy custom night cutscene in Sister Location shows Springtrap and Fazbear's Fright burning. Many interpreted this as a flash forward rather than indication of placement, but some theorists argue it suggests Sister Location occurs close to or after FNaF 3's timeframe. Michael's speech at the end about coming to find his father and declaring, "I'm going to come find you," could mean he's speaking immediately before the events of FNaF 3, having just experienced Sister Location and now heading to Fazbear's Fright, where he knows Springtrap will be. The Tales from the Pizzaplex story Dittophobia mentions that Circus Baby's facility was abandoned by William Afton 10 years before the story's present, with the animatronics still intact. If Afton abandoned the facility because he was spring-locked, which happened in 1993 or later based on other evidence, 10 years later would place Sister Location's events well after FNaF 1's timeframe. However, this assumes the books and games share exact chronology, which may not be accurate given Scott's statements about separate continuities. Some argue that Michael's message to William about finding him and putting Elizabeth back together makes more sense if William is already trapped in Springtrap. How would William have sent Michael to the facility if William was already sealed in the safe room? One explanation suggests William left instructions before his spring locking, perhaps anticipating his potential death and wanting Michael to free Elizabeth posthumously. Alternatively, the monologue might be Michael talking to himself about future plans rather than responding to contemporary orders. The debate extends to Michael's physical state and the mechanics of remnant regeneration. If Michael was scooped before FNaF 1, his purple corpse appearance seems like it should raise more alarm than just being fired for odor. However, the remnant regeneration theory proposes that the remnant from the fun times that was inside Ennard, and therefore inside Michael, began slowly regenerating his body. By the time of FNaF 1, he might have regenerated enough to appear relatively normal with only the odor giving away his undead state. His blue eyes in a FNaF 1's game over screen could indicate his human eye color before being scooped, while his purple eyes at Sister Location's end show his undead state. The private room in Sister Location contains a monitor showing the FNaF 1 office, which some interpret as William monitoring the location in real time, suggesting the events occur simultaneously. Others view this as a security feed from archives or a design Easter egg rather than canon evidence. Similar screens show other locations, and interpreting all of them as simultaneous creates timeline impossibilities. Phone Guy's existence complicates the after FNaF 1 theory. Phone Guy dies in FNaF 1, yet Hand Unit, in Sister Location, mimics Phone Guy's speaking patterns and seems designed to replace him. If Sister Location operates after Phone Guy's death, Hand Unit being his replacement makes sense, but Hand Unit never explicitly states he's replacing Phone Guy, and the stylistic similarity might just be Fazbear Entertainment's corporate communication style rather than direct replacement. Part of why this debate persists is that both placements require assumptions about unclear evidence. Placing Sister Location before FNaF 1 requires accepting that Michael can hold down a job as an animated corpse, and that the remnant timeline doesn't need William to collect it from the classics. Placing it after FNaF 1 requires accepting that William could send Michael on this mission after being spring-locked, possibly through pre-death instructions, and that Hand Unit's existence makes sense despite Phone Guy being gone. The community seems to increasingly favor the before FNaF 1 placement, particularly Sister Location occurring around 1988-1990, after FNaF 2, but before FNaF 1. This timeline allows for the odor explanation, fits the survival logbook references, and aligns with Hand Unit's dialogue about the closure that prompted Serko's baby's opening. The remnant question gets resolved by proposing William collected remnant earlier than the Follow Me minigames suggest, perhaps from the withered animatronics during or shortly after FNaF 2, or that the Fun Times possession doesn't require remnant from the classics at all, but comes from Elizabeth and experiments with agony. Under this placement, the chronological order becomes FNaF 4 in 1983, showing the bite of 83, Circus Baby's Pizza World opening and quickly closing after Elizabeth's death, sometime in the mid-1980s, FNaF 2 in November 1987, the remnant experiments and funtime creation occurring in the late 1980s to early 1990s, Sister Location's main gameplay, happening sometime before FNaF 1 in the early 1990s, Follow Me and William's spring-locking sometime after FNaF 1's closure, FNaF 3 in 2023, and Pizzeria Simulator shortly after. This timeline isn't without holes. Questions remain about exactly when and how William obtained remnant, if not from Follow Me's dismantling. Debate continues about whether the novel's timeline details apply to the games. Uncertainty persists about Michael's physical state and how he maintains employment. But the before FNaF 1 placement creates fewer total contradictions than the alternatives, While honoring most of the direct evidence from games and books, the sister location placement debate exemplifies how FNAF's non-linear storytelling creates interpretation challenges. Games weren't released in chronological order. Evidence comes from multiple sources with varying canonicity. Crucial details are implied rather than stated. And Scott's comments about certain elements being up to interpretation mean that some questions might not have definitive intended answers. What makes this particular debate frustrating for many theorists is that it seems like something that should be straightforward. When does a specific game happen? Why don't we know for sure? The answer is that sister location was designed with deliberate ambiguity, leaving enough clues to support multiple interpretations without confirming any single one. This might have been intentional, allowing the story to work regardless of exact placement. Or it might have been an oversight as Scott built out the story without fully cementing this particular game's position. Future releases could clarify this placement if they make explicit references to sister location's timing relative to other events. Until then, theorists will continue examining paycheck dates, dialogue phrasing, logbook entries, and remnant mechanics, building increasingly elaborate arguments for their preferred chronology. The sister location placement remains one of FNAF's most active debates, a timeline question that refuses to settle despite years of analysis. As we drift through these theoretical waters, remember that timeline debates like this one are both frustrating and valuable. They're frustrating because the lack of clear answers feels like a puzzle missing pieces. But they're valuable because they force close reading of every piece of evidence, creative thinking about mechanics and motivations, and careful construction of arguments that can withstand scrutiny. Even without resolution, the debate itself enriches understanding of FNAF's universe, making theorists consider how Remnant works, what Michael's journey looks like, and how Fazbear Entertainment's various locations and ventures interconnect. Sometimes the question teaches us more than the answer ever could. The dream theories rise and fall. In the annals of FNAF theorizing, no single theory has experienced as dramatic an arc as the dream theory, soaring from promising explanation to community consensus to ultimate rejection and mockery. The dream theory proposed that some or all of the games, particularly FNAF 1 through 4, were nightmares experienced by the crying child as he lay in a coma following the bite of 83, that none of the horror, murder, and possession had actually occurred, just the fevered dreams of a dying child's mind. For a time, this theory seemed to elegantly explain numerous oddities in the early games. Its subsequent debunking and community rejection taught valuable lessons about over-theorizing, about the difference between thematic connections and literal explanations, and about how Scott Cawthon responds when the community veers dramatically off course. The dream theory gained traction during and after FNAF 4's release in 2015. The game was explicitly set in a child's nightmare, with nightmare versions of the animatronics attacking the player in a house environment rather than a pizzeria. The gameplay took place in a bedroom with a child's furniture, toys, and a closet and doors to defend. Between nights, minigames showed the crying child's traumatic week leading to his death. The connections seemed obvious. FNAF 4's nightmare gameplay represented this child's coma dreams. But some theorists took the concept further, asking, what if earlier games were also dreams? This would explain numerous issues that had puzzled the community. Why do animatronics behave in ways that make no mechanical sense? Why does Golden Freddy appear as a slumped suit that crashes your game? Why do hallucinations occur throughout FNAF 1? Why does Foxy run down halls at impossible speeds? Why can the puppet fly? Dream logic would explain all these impossibilities better than any mechanical justification. The theory's most famous piece of evidence was the alarm clock. In FNaF 1, 2, and 3, completing a night ends with a grandfather clock chiming, a deep sonorous sound marking 6 a.m. In FNaF 4, the night ends with a digital alarm clock beeping, a completely different sound. Dream theory proponents proposed this difference was intentional and meaningful. The first 3 games were the crying child's dreams while in the coma, represented by the grandfather clock, sounds he might hear in the hospital or associate with his home. When he finally died, represented by FNaF 4's flatline, the alarm clock changed to show the dream was ending, reality breaking through. MatPat of the Game Theorists championed a version of dream theory in one of his most viewed FNaF videos. He proposed that much of what players experienced wasn't literal, but rather symbolic. The crying child's subconscious processing trauma, the missing children, the murders, the possessed animatronics, all could be metaphorical representations of the child's fears and the tragedy of his own death. This interpretation had elegance, turning FNaF from a relatively straightforward horror story with supernatural elements into a psychological examination of a dying child's last thoughts. The theory provided answers for elements that otherwise seemed like game design choices without lore significance. Why can you hallucinate? Because you're dreaming. Why do animatronics teleport or appear illogically? Dream logic. Why does the layout not quite make sense? Dreams don't follow spatial logic. Why do so many impossible things happen? None of it's real. The dream theory was a universal explanation that could cover any plot hole or mechanical oddity by simply declaring it part of the dream. However, the theory had problems from the start, problems that would eventually lead to its spectacular collapse. First, it undermined the entire emotional weight of the story. If none of the murders actually happened, if the children weren't really killed and stuffed into suits, if their spirits weren't actually trapped seeking justice, then what was the point? The horror of FNaF came from its backstory, from the tragedy of children murdered at a place meant to bring them joy, dismissing all that as dreams gutted the narrative's impact. Second, later games became impossible to explain under dream theory. If FNaF 1-4 were dreams, what was Sister Location? Was that also a dream? How could the crying child dream about events involving his siblings if he never knew about them? What about Pizzeria Simulator's explicit dialogue about real events? What about Help Wanted taking place decades later? The theory required increasingly elaborate explanations to incorporate new games, eventually proposing nested dreams or the consciousness of the dreamer somehow observing real events. Third, evidence actively contradicted dream theory. The newspapers in FNaF 1 describing the missing children's incident weren't styled as dream imagery. Phone Guy's recordings presented information about real events, and his death in Night 4 carried narrative weight only if it actually happened. The subtle environmental storytelling throughout the series assumed a real physical world with history and consequences. Dream theory required dismissing enormous amounts of carefully placed world building as meaningless. The community response to dream theory became increasingly negative. Many fans felt betrayed by the suggestion that the story they'd been following was just imagination. The theory seemed like a cop-out, an easy way to avoid explaining difficult plot points by declaring them unimportant. Debates grew heated between dream theory supporters and those who insisted on literal interpretation. The split threatened to fracture the community between those who wanted psychological horror and those who wanted supernatural mystery. Then Scott Cawthon intervened. On MatPat's Dream Theory video, Scott left a comment stating that MatPat had overlooked one crucial detail. The community exploded with renewed investigation. What was the crucial detail? Reading through comment sections, many people were pointing out the 1983 date on the TV in FNaF 4, the evidence for the bite of 83, rather than the bite of 87 that MatPat's theory relied on. Some wondered if Scott was indicating something else about Dream Theory itself, but the most common interpretation focused on the date evidence. Scott later made more direct statements, though not always publicly, that clarified his intentions. He expressed frustration that Dream Theory had gained such traction, indicating that he never intended for the games to be literal dreams. The community interpreted his various comments and subsequent game releases as confirmation that the events, the murders, the possessions, all happened in the story's reality. FNaF 4's nightmares might be dreams experienced by someone, possibly Michael Afton reliving his guilt, or experiencing hallucinations induced by experiments, but the other games portrayed real events in the FNaF universe, not dream visions. This rejection by the creator effectively killed Dream Theory for most of the community. It became a cautionary tale, the theory everyone points to when discussions of overreaching interpretation arise. Remember, Dream Theory became shorthand for, we're probably overthinking this. The theory's failure taught the community to be more careful about theories that explain too much too easily, to value evidence that points towards specific answers rather than universal explanations. But the Dream Theory's crash and burn provided valuable lessons beyond just caution. It revealed how much the community valued literal storytelling over metaphorical interpretation. When given the choice between real murders with supernatural consequences and symbolic representation of trauma, the fan base overwhelmingly preferred the concrete horror. FNaF fans wanted to solve mysteries, not interpret symbolism. They wanted timelines with real events, not narrative deconstruction. The theory's rise and fall also demonstrated the community's relationship with Scott as an authority. When Scott himself says a theory is wrong, that settles it for most people, despite some theorists continuing to find ways to preserve elements they liked. This deference to creator intention shapes FNaF theorizing differently than some fandoms, where death of the author principles allow interpretation regardless of creator statements. In FNaF, Scott's word carries weight, though not so much weight that all debate ends. Dream Theory's legacy lingers in how theorists discuss new games. When something seems too strange or illogical, someone will inevitably joke, "Must be a dream," before the community collectively rejects that easy explanation. The theory also taught wariness about theories based on perceived symbolism without concrete evidence. The grandfather clock versus alarm clock difference might have been purely audio design choice rather than lore significance. Learning to distinguish between meaningful clues and coincidental details became essential. Interestingly, FNaF 4's nightmares weren't completely removed from lore significance even after Dream Theory's rejection. Evidence suggests they might be real animatronics created by William Afton for fear experiments, or hallucinations induced by gas in the underground facility, or Michael Afton's guilt-induced nightmares, or some combination of these possibilities. The nightmares matter. They're just not encompassing all previous games, as some suggested. This shows how a wrong theory can still contain elements of truth, properly scaled down from universal explanation to specific application. The Dream Theory episode also revealed Scott's willingness to course correct when the community misinterprets something drastically. He could have let Dream Theory persist, incorporating it into future games or remaining ambiguous. Instead, he clearly stated it was wrong, protecting his story's integrity, even if it meant disappointing theorists who'd invested in that interpretation. This established a pattern where Scott provides guidance when the community gets truly lost, though he remains quiet when interpretations are merely debatable rather than fundamentally wrong. For new FNaF theorists encountering this history, Dream Theory serves as a warning and a learning opportunity. The warning: don't assume everything is metaphor. Don't embrace theories that make everything simple by making nothing real. Don't ignore evidence that contradicts your preferred interpretation. The learning opportunity: study how the community identified problems with the theory, how Scott's intervention worked, how alternative explanations proved more robust. The theory also highlights the importance of falsifiability in FNaF theories. Good theories should make predictions that can be proven wrong. Dream Theory was almost unfalsifiable. Any new information could be incorporated by saying, "It's part of the dream." This made it unsatisfying from an investigation standpoint, because it couldn't lead anywhere. Theories that make specific, testable claims about timeline, identity, and mechanism prove more valuable even when wrong, because they can be refined or replaced based on new evidence. As we explore other theories, remember Dream Theory's trajectory. Sometimes the community gets swept up in ideas that seem brilliant until scrutinized. Sometimes creators need to explicitly reject interpretations to keep their stories on track. Sometimes the most obvious explanation, that what we're seeing actually happened in the story's world, proves correct even when more elaborate alternatives seem clever. Dream Theory was FNaF theorizing's Icarus moment, flying too high on wings of over-interpretation before crashing back to Earth with clarifying statements from the creator. The quiet irony is that FNaF does involve dreams and nightmares, just not as universally as Dream Theory proposed. Elements of FNaF 4 are nightmares, possibly induced mechanically. The Freddy files and other sources confirm nightmare animatronics exist in some form. Michael Afton might experience trauma-induced nightmares. The line between reality and dream state occasionally blurs, but the core events, the murders, the possessions, the real tragedies, those happened in the world of the story, and that's what makes them horrifying. Looking back, Dream Theory represented a moment when the community wanted elegant simplicity from a story that rewards patience and acceptance of complexity. FNaF isn't a puzzle with one neat solution. It's an archaeological site where you dig through layers of buried truth. Dream Theory tried to explain the entire site as a single artifact, when really it's thousands of pieces that need individual identification and careful arrangement. The theory's failure redirected the community toward that more laborious, but ultimately more rewarding approach to investigation. As you drift through your own theorizing or evaluation of other theories, keep Dream Theory in mind, not as a shameful mistake, but as an educational one. Every investigative community needs its cautionary tales, its examples of how brilliance can lead astray when divorced from evidence. Dream Theory filled that role for FNaF, teaching a generation of theorists to stay grounded, to value what the story actually says over what would be cool or clever, and to remember that sometimes a haunted animatronic is just a haunted animatronic, not a symbol of childhood trauma dissolving in the twilight of a dying mind. Looking forward, What remains unknown as we drift toward the close of this journey through Five Nights at Freddy's theories, having explored bytes and robots, possessions and timelines, dreams and digital devils, it's worth acknowledging how much remains unsolved despite years of community investigation. The franchise continues to evolve, with new games, books, and media adding layers while sometimes answering old questions. Steel Wool Studios, having taken over development from Scott Cawthon, carries the franchise into new technological territory with VR and modern gameplay, while attempting to honor the mysterious storytelling that made FNaF special. Looking ahead, certain mysteries persist. Questions that keep theorists returning to evidence boards and Reddit threads. Debates that will likely continue until explicit answers emerge or the franchise reaches whatever conclusion Scott envisions. The identity and purpose of Shadow Freddy and Shadow Bonnie remain tantalizingly unclear. These dark apparitions appear throughout the series, sometimes helping, sometimes hindering, always mysterious. Are they agony manifestations from tragic events? Are they William Afton in different forms? Are they connected to the experiments in the sister location facility? The shadows have been present since FNaF 2, yet their exact nature remains debated. Theories range from them being representations of Springlock failure victims, to dark remnant given form, to hallucinations induced by various means, to entities connected to the Mimic's influence. Each new game provides small clues without definitive revelation, keeping this mystery active. The box from FNaF 4 haunts theorists with its unrealized promise. After completing the Halloween update, players received an image of a locked box with text stating some things are best left forgotten for now. Scott later confirmed on Reddit that the box had an answer, that there was something specific it represented, but that the community never figured it out. He added that he worried its contents would be disappointing after years of speculation, suggesting perhaps he decided not to reveal it. This meta-mystery, a puzzle about whether we should even want the answer, represents FNaF's relationship with ambiguity. Sometimes mysteries remain mysterious not because evidence is lacking, but because the creator chooses preservation over revelation. Midnight Motorist continues generating conflicting interpretations years after its appearance in Pizzeria Simulator. This minigame showing a purple car, an orange figure, a house with a locked room, footprints leading to Freddy's, and mysterious dialogue has been interpreted as showing William Afton's home life, Michael's troubled youth, the crying child running away, or even an unrelated story. The Junior's location, the that place dialogue, the broken window, the he'll be sorry threat, each element suggests meaning without confirming it. Debates rage about who we're playing as, whose footprints we're following, what that place refers to, and how this scene fits into the timeline. It's a perfect encapsulation of FNaF's storytelling. Seemingly simple imagery packed with significance that reveals itself only through connection to broader patterns. The identity of the Fredbear Plush's speaker remains unclear despite its importance to FNaF 4. This plush follows the crying child, offering cryptic warnings and advice, culminating in the promise, "I will put you back together." Is it William Afton monitoring his son? Henry Emily trying to protect him? The puppet spirit reaching across time? An AI of some kind? The Golden Freddy spirit speaking from the future? Different evidence points different directions, and the answer matters because it tells us about family relationships, technological capabilities, and supernatural mechanics in the FNaF world. The plush represents one of the franchise's longest-running mysteries, present from FNaF 4's release yet still unresolved. What happened to Glamrock Bonnie occupies security breach theorists' attention, with limited evidence to work from. The character existed, as shown through various references, posters, and Freddy's obvious grief at his absence. But Glamrock Bonnie was deactivated before the game's events, possibly destroyed by Montgomery Gator in his quest for stardom, possibly damaged through other means. The golf courses near Bonnie Bowl show evidence of struggle, but definitive explanation remains absent. This mystery matters less for timeline reasons and more for understanding the Glamrock animatronics' relationships and the darkness lurking beneath the Pizzaplex's cheerful exterior. Was it murder, accident, something related to Glitchtrap or the Mimic? The answer would tell us about moral agency in animatronics and the extent of corruption in that location. The Ruin DLC's ending left perhaps Security Breach's biggest question: who cut the elevator cable? When Cassie escapes the Mimic after reactivating it, she reaches an elevator. Gregory's voice, or something mimicking Gregory, states, "I'm sorry," before the cable is cut, dropping Cassie into darkness. Debate immediately erupted about whether the real Gregory did this to prevent the Mimic's escape, prioritizing many lives over Cassie's, or whether the Mimic cut the cable while mimicking Gregory's voice, with the real Gregory's warnings coming too late. The distinction matters enormously for Gregory's character and moral culpability. Evidence exists for both interpretations, and Steel Wool likely left this deliberately ambiguous, knowing the community would debate it endlessly. The storyteller's full influence on the Pizzaplex and its connection to the Mimic program needs clarification. Tales from the Pizzaplex established the storyteller as an animatronic tree that uses the Mimic and program to generate stories and influence other animatronics through those narratives. Its manipulation extends to implanting ideas, changing behaviors, and potentially causing the hostile takeover of the Pizzaplex's systems. But exactly how it connects to Glitchtrap, whether it was a vessel for the Mimic's consciousness, and what role it played in Security Breach's events remains unclear. The storyteller represents the franchise's expansion into concepts about narrative and control, about how stories themselves can be dangerous, a meta-commentary on FNaF's own storytelling power. The relationship between the game timeline and the movie timeline requires ongoing attention as the film series develops. The first FNaF movie, released in October 2023, told a story inspired by the games, but with significant changes. Mike Schmidt is a troubled man dealing with trauma, not Michael Afton on a redemption quest. Abby is his sister, not his daughter or brother. The missing children have different dynamics. William Afton's motivation includes manipulating animatronics to kidnap Abby, rather than just murder for remnant experiments. As sequels develop, watching how closely they hew to or diverge from game lore will be fascinating. Will they remain completely separate continuities, or will later films incorporate elements that illuminate game mysteries? Scott's involvement in the movies suggests some canonical connection could exist, but the extent remains to be seen. Help Wanted 2's implications for the digital realm and what's happening with the Mimic's code need further exploration. The game suggests Glitchtrap might have been defeated in Princess Quest, but what does defeat mean for an AI? Can it truly be deleted? Or does it persist in backup systems and distributed code? The memory plushie's mechanics suggest Glitchtrap, or the Mimic, can reconstruct itself from collected memories of William Afton's crimes. This raises questions about whether the threat is truly ended or merely dormant, whether new manifestations might emerge, and whether Vanessa remains influenced despite being freed from obvious control. The full extent of William Afton's experiments and what he was trying to accomplish with Remnant remains somewhat unclear despite years of evidence. Was he pursuing immortality for himself, trying to bring the crying child back, simply fascinated by the process, creating animatronics capable of evil for some larger purpose? His motivations shift across different sources, and while we know the what, child murder and remnant harvesting, the why behind his descent into serial killing beyond implied jealousy of Henry. Emily hasn't been definitively established. Understanding what drove Afton would contextualize the entire franchise's horrors. The fate of Vanessa after security breaches Princess Quest ending and her role going forward remains to be seen. She's freed from Glitchtrap's control. But what does that mean for her, psychologically? What responsibility does she bear for actions committed while influenced? Can she have a normal life? Or is she forever tied to Fazbear Entertainment's horrors? Her story represents one of FNaF's first extended depictions of someone surviving and escaping the cycle of tragedy that consumes most characters. Seeing how her arc continues could provide hope that some people can emerge from this franchise's darkness. Whether Gregory is truly Patient 46 and what his full story entails needs clarification. While GGY strongly suggests this connection, the implications haven't been fully explored. If Gregory was possessed or controlled by the Mimic during therapy sessions, killing therapists and manipulating systems, what does that mean for his moral culpability? Is he a victim or a villain? Can he remember his actions? The distinction between Gregory as himself and Gregory under the Mimic's influence requires clearer delineation for us to understand his character and his relationship with Vanessa and Glamrock Freddy. The full map of Fazbear Entertainment's corporate history, all the locations, openings, closures and transitions, likely will never be completely clear despite community efforts to construct comprehensive timelines. New games add new locations, books reference places not seen in games, and the exact sequence of events remains debated. The perfect timeline might be impossible because Scott and Steel Wool prefer ambiguity, allowing flexibility for new content rather than cementing every date and connection. This frustrates completionists but enables the franchise's ongoing evolution. Looking ahead to future games, several projects promise potential answers or new mysteries. The Dead by Daylight collaboration introduced FNaF to a new format and audience, but its lore implications remain uncertain. The movie sequels will continue exploring their version of the story. Steel Wool has confirmed more game content is in development. The book series continue publishing. Each release is an opportunity for revelation and complication, for old questions to receive answers and new questions to emerge. The community's role in this ongoing investigation continues to be vital. As new content releases, theorists will decode, debate, and construct understanding from intentional obscurity. The next generation of FNaF theorists, those just discovering the franchise or those who'll grow into it as older fans move on, will bring fresh perspectives to old mysteries and native understanding to new ones. The culture of investigation that FNaF created has become self-sustaining, capable of continuing regardless of whether Scott remains directly involved or whether official answers ever arrive for every question. For those drifting off to sleep with these theories swimming through their thoughts, remember that not knowing everything is part of FNaF's appeal. The mysteries aren't bugs in the storytelling, they're features. They're invitations to engage, to theorize, to participate in collaborative world building. Every unsolved mystery represents a conversation yet to be had, a connection yet to be made, a future moment of realization when that one detail finally clicks into place. The theories we've explored tonight, from bites to robots, from golden bears to digital devils, from timeline placement to dream interpretation, represent just a fraction of FNaF's theoretical landscape. Countless other theories exist about minor characters, about mechanics of possession, about the significance of specific colors or numbers or phrases. The depth is essentially infinite for those willing to dive deep enough. What makes Five Nights at Freddy's special isn't just the horror, though the scares are effective and the atmosphere masterful. It's not just the gameplay, though the mechanics are engaging and have spawned countless imitators. It's the way the story is told, the way Scott Cawthon and his team trust their audience to be intelligent, patient, and dedicated enough to excavate meaning from clues. It's the respect shown to players by making them work for understanding. It's the community that formed around this shared investigation, connecting people across the world through common interest in possessed animatronics and murdered children and fathers who became monsters. As you drift further towards sleep, let these stories settle in your mind not as definitive truths, but as possibilities, interpretations, the community's best effort to make sense of intentional mystery. Remember that theories are living things, changing as new evidence emerges, that today's consensus might be tomorrow's outdated notion, and that's okay. The journey of theorizing, of investigation and debate, and eventual understanding or continued mystery, that journey is the point. Whether you believe Gregory is a robot or a boy, whether you think Cassidy stands alone in Golden Freddy, or shares space with the crying child, whether you place sister location before or after FNaF 1, whether you accept the Mimic as Glitchtrap, or maintain hope that William Afton's spirit persists, your interpretation is part of FNaF's story. Every theorist contributes to the collective understanding, and even wrong theories teach us something about the evidence and about how we approach mystery. So rest now. Let the theories fade into the background hum of your thoughts. Let the mysteries remain mysterious for tonight at least. Tomorrow, you can return to evidence and debate if you choose. But for now, in this quiet space where animatronics wait motionless and spirits find whatever peace they can, just let the stories be stories. Let the questions remain questions, and drift into sleep knowing that somewhere other theorists are awake, still investigating, still debating, still adding pieces to the ever-growing puzzle of Five Nights at Freddy's. Thank you for joining me on this journey through FNaF's theoretical landscape. If you enjoyed this exploration, please like and subscribe. Share your own theories in the comments. Tell me which debates you find most compelling. Let me know what mysteries keep you up at night. Until next time, rest well. Dream of answered questions or comfortable mysteries. And remember that in the world of Five Nights at Freddy's, even the most certain answers often hide one more question underneath. Good night.